Canada gets a lot of freebies from us. By the way, they should be grateful also, but they're not.
President Trump thinks Canada will cave in. We will never, ever bow down to a bully.
White House has announced new 50% tariffs against Canada on a wide array of products. The White House says Donald Trump signed 3 proclamations to impose additional 50% tariffs on certain goods from Canada. It says in its response to, quote, Canada's discriminatory treatment of American exports on cars, alcohol, and dairy, and that the products covered include everything from wine to hockey sticks to cement. The White House says the tariffs apply whether or not a good is covered under CUSMA and will take effect in 30 days. Premier Ford reacting to the news tonight on X, saying, I'll never stop fighting to protect Ontario. If these tariffs proceed, Canada should respond tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar.
I find it a shame the administration in the U.S. and Congress people writing these letters and blaming us and so on and so forth. They have a very short memory. We had the water bombers, everyone ready, going over to California. It was last year. We sent down hydro linemen down to the Carolinas and Georgia to help out. That's what neighbors do, right? You don't get on and start threatening and criticizing, because guess what? One day it's going to be your turn. And we're going to be down there without hesitation to support our neighbors, which we should be. But all the rhetoric going on there, and it's not from all Americans. I'll tell you, Americans love Canadians, and we Canadians love Americans. But to make the comments they did through the administration, unacceptable.
Even when Canada plays nice with the U.S., Trump hits us with something else. So a lot of Canadians who started out wanting to play nice, they've completely changed their tune. And now they support a total boycott on all American products. Canada's stand against Trump's bullying, it's not just a short-term protest. It's a full-on grassroots revolution, and it's here to stay. It's not a boycott anymore. It's become a way of life.
When the U.S. is on fire, Canada sends over firefighters, aircrafts, they share equipment, and Canadian experts help coordinate operations. When Canada is on fire, Trump threatens them with tariffs. Why do you fucking think people fucking hate us? Everyone hates the U.S. They're just jealous of us. Yeah, they're so jealous that they don't have a president in the Epstein files. How did we get so lucky? We hit the jackpot with him, huh? To our Canadian neighbors, thank you so much for helping us in the country of California. Us Californians are very grateful for all that you do whenever we're on fire. Thank you so much from the country of California.
Well, he did it, folks. He went there. So Donald Trump has indeed threatened Canada with sanctions and tariffs due to the wildfire smoke that is going over the border. Ironically, it's not just coming from Canada, it's coming from the United States too. However, he has said, and I quote, "We are holding Canada responsible for the fact that they are not properly maintaining their forests and brush therein, and the United States is being unnecessarily invaded by filthy, polluted Canadian and unhealthy Canadian air, the quality of which is dangerous and totally unacceptable." And he posted this on social media. This statement by Donald Trump makes the United States of America look like the biggest horse's ass on the entire planet.
So Donald Trump made a post threatening tariffs on Canada because of the forest fires are causing smoke pollution in the United States. And we're not taking proper care of our forests, and we're not raking and shit like that. So he's going to levy tariffs on Canadians, and he's going to call Mark Carney about this. This is a guy that has deregulated everything, anything to do with protecting the environment, okay? This is a climate change denier, but it's Mark Carney's fault that there's forest fires that are like leveling entire communities. Anybody who voted for this dipshit 3 times and continues to support him, you are part of a cult.
The United States is putting up to 50% tariffs on Canadian plywood furniture, wine exports, paper, and the list just goes on. Donald Trump is testing this new murky legislation from 1930 to see if he can actually get these tariffs through. The reason why he's slapping Canada with these specific new tariffs is because of the quote-unquote wildfires that apparently Canada is somehow purposely sending wildfire smoke down to American cities as if we're not trying to clean that mess up. Let's also not forget when California was burning and had their wildfire situations, Canadians were there to help them. And when we're having a wildfire situation, the Americans decide to tariff us. This will give the Americans some sort of leverage and bargaining chips because right now there's going to be a massive free trade agreement negotiation taking place and the Americans are trying to stack their chips. So when they go into these negotiations, the Canadians have no choice but to bend. And it just sucks because why are you doing this to Canada? Canada is like one of the most amazing allies you can have.
You ain't even gonna believe this shit. So with Canada currently having hundreds of natural wildfires currently going on, dozens of them completely out of control, do you think we'd be sending fire trucks and help to our next door neighbor, to our world's biggest trading partner, to our allies? Do you think we'd be helping them? No. Instead, Donald Trump said he's gonna increase their tariffs due to the inconvenience of the smoke hovering over our states. This guy's the devil. What a piece of shit.
He's now in this tirade about this is all Canada's fault and they should be doing a better job. And if they don't get their act together, he's going to, as I said, slap tariffs on them. But in the meantime, the people who are suffering are people not only in Canada, of course, but as you mentioned, in the Midwest, in the Northeast of the United States. In New York City, I saw a picture just yesterday at, I think it was midday, but it looked, the skyline behind the Statue of Liberty looked like it was sunset because it was glowing orange, and that was because of the smoke in the air from Canada.
The White House is once again taking aim at Canada, announcing 50% tariffs on a range of goods. This in response to what Washington calls discriminatory trade policies affecting U.S. exports. A senior administration official says Canada is one of only 2 countries that retaliated against the American tariff regime, citing bans on sales of U.S. alcohol and dairy quotas. As a result, President Donald Trump has signed 3 proclamations which will see tariffs imposed on, as the administration puts it, everything from wine to hockey sticks to cement. Energy and potash will be exempt, but products that were previously tariff-free under the terms of CUSMA could be hit. The levies are set to come into effect within 30 days. The White House says these tariffs are not connected to wildfire smoke drifting across the border into the U.S. states.
So family, for years, one of the easiest political talking points in conservative circles was to paint Canada as everything America should never become. It was portrayed as a country buried under taxes, crippled by government programs, weakened by progressive politics, and somehow destined for economic collapse. And so every challenge Canada faced became proof that the country had chosen the wrong path. And so every disagreement between Ottawa and Washington was framed as evidence that Canada was making one mistake after the other. But something interesting has started happening, family. A growing number of conservative commentators, independent voters, and even people who proudly identify with the MAGA movement are beginning to acknowledge something that they rarely said publicly before, that Canada may not have been the problem after all. And so that doesn't really mean everyone suddenly agrees with Canada's politics. Far from it, family. Canada still has debates over immigration, housing affordability, healthcare wait times, taxes, and even government spending. And so Canadians themselves argue passionately over those issues every single day. But what is changing is the realization that many of the predictions made about Canada's downfall simply did not unfold the way critics expected. And so instead, people are beginning to separate political disagreements from objective reality. And when inflation became a global issue, family, it wasn't really unique to Canada. Europe experienced it, the United States also experienced it, Australia, and even countries around the world struggled with rising prices after the pandemic disrupted supply chains, and even central bank aggressively increased interest rates. And so suddenly it became much harder to argue that Canada's economic challenges were somehow proof that its entire political system had failed. Then came trade. Many expected Canada to be economically cornered whenever tensions with Washington increased. Instead, Canada continued expanding trade relationships with Europe, Asia, and even other global partners. And so businesses adapted, export markets diversified. While there were certainly the disruptions, Canada didn't simply collapse because political rhetoric predicted it would. And that forced many observers to reconsider earlier assumptions. And so the conversation also shifted when Americans themselves started comparing everyday quality of life issues.
rising healthcare costs, housing affordability, education expenses, and even prescription drug prices and even public infrastructure became increasingly common topics inside the United States. And so rather than constantly looking north to criticize Canada, many Americans started asking questions about challenges closer to home. And in other words, the focus changed. And so instead of asking why Canada wasn't failing, more people started asking why certain problems existed within the United States, despite years of promises that different policies would solve them. And so that shift in perspective really matters, family. And so political campaigns often depend rather on identifying an opponent. Sometimes that opponent is another political party. Sometimes it's another country. Canada frequently became a convenient comparison because it's geographically close. It's also culturally familiar and shares one of the world's largest trading relationships with the United States. But comparisons only work if they reflect reality. And as time passed, family, many Americans visited Canada, worked with Canadians, consumed American media, or simply followed economic data more closely. And their personal experiences often looked very different from the political narratives that they had. And so they discovered that cities that remained economically vibrant, they saw thriving technology sectors. They noticed growing investments in artificial intelligence, clean energy, manufacturing, and even critical minerals. And so they realized that Canada's financial institutions remained relatively stable compared with many international counterparts. And again, none of this means Canada is perfect, family. Housing affordability remains one of Canada's biggest challenges, and many young Canadians struggle to purchase homes. Healthcare wait times continue to generate criticism. Immigration policy remains one of the country's most divisive debates. And so provincial governments frequently clash with the federal government over budgets and priorities. And so these are genuine concerns, family. But genuine concerns are different from declining or declaring an entire country as failure. And so perhaps that is the biggest lesson emerging today, family. Political narratives often reward certainty. Reality rarely does. And so it's much easier to tell audiences that another country is collapsing than it is to explain complex economic trends, demographic changes, global supply chains, or even international trade relationships. And so simple stories spread faster, nuanced discussions take longer. Yet over time, facts have a way of reshaping public opinion, and that appears to be exactly what we are witnessing, family. Some voices within conservative media are becoming more selective with their criticism, and others openly acknowledge that Canada has managed several economic and even diplomatic challenges better than expected. And independent voters who once repeated talking points about Canada's inevitable decline are increasingly recognizing that the situation is more complicated than political slogans suggested. And this doesn't really erase ideological differences, family. Many Americans will continue preferring lower taxes, smaller government, or even different approaches to healthcare and immigration. And Canadians will continue debating their own political future as well. And so healthy democracies are supposed to have disagreements. And the difference is that disagreement no longer requires pretending the other country has failed. Perhaps that's where the discussion is finally maturing. Instead of reducing Canada to a political talking point, more people are evaluating it based on measurable outcomes, economic performance, international influence, and even the lived experiences of ordinary Canadians. And that creates a more honest conversation, family. And so increasingly, or interestingly, Canada's relationship with the United States has always been more interconnected than many political debates suggest. And so millions of jobs depend on cross-border trade. Businesses invest in both countries, families live across the border, industries rely on one another every single day. And neither country succeeds by hoping the other fails. In fact, both become stronger when cooperation outweighs political data. And maybe that's why this shift is is attracting so much attention. And when people who were once among Canada's loudest critics begin admitting that Canada was never actually the problem, it signals something larger than one political debate. It suggests that reality is becoming harder to ignore than rhetoric. And so whether this becomes a lasting shift or simply another chapter in the ever-changing political conversation remains to be seen. But one thing is increasingly clear, family. Canada didn't suddenly become perfect. Instead, many people simply began seeing it more clearly than before. And sometimes changing the conversation begins not because one country changed, but because people finally changed the way they looked at it.